Hey everybody, this is a piece by Alec Nove A, and it's titled A Note on Trotsky and the quote, Left Opposition, 1929 to 1931. This article is originally from 1977. So here we go. This note is based upon a reading of 2 years' issues of Bulletin Oppositie, published first in Paris and then in Berlin by a group of Trotskyists, and containing a great many articles written by Trotsky himself during the first years of his forced exile from Russia. Also of importance are the occasional contributions from oppositionists smuggled out of the USSR, especially the thoughtful and intelligent ideas of Christian Rakovsky. I set myself, in reading through the journal, the following questions. What light does it shed on how Trotsky and his friends understood what was happening in Russia and in the Comintern during these dramatic years? Of course, it is easy to criticize with the evidence of hindsight, and naturally there could and would be errors of interpretation, especially when they were cut off from systematic communication with one another and with what was happening in the Soviet Union. However, it would still be proper to comment critically on their basic approach to the reality of the time. As we shall see, there were some points on which they showed acute understanding of events and trends. There were others where there seemed to be a fundamental misunderstanding. Or so it seems to me. The whole subject is very discussionny, to use the Russian word for controversial. A few words are needed to set the scene. The first issue of the Bulletin was dated January 1929. Trotsky had been exiled to Alma-Ata at the beginning of 1928 and expelled to Turkey in February 1929. In these years, and until Trotsky was killed, Trotsky was chief editor of the journal, his son Leon Sadov, the working editor. Trotsky's fellow oppositionists were arrested and exiled in large numbers during 1928. However, during the same year, having destroyed the quote lefts, Stalin himself turned left. Stalin broke his alliance with Bukharin by adopting a policy of forcible procurements of grain and other measures increasingly inconsistent with the new economic policy. Mass collectivization had not yet begun. Successive drafts of the five-year plan of industrial development became more and more ambitious. In the Comintern, the policies of comparative moderation, symbolized in Trotsky's eyes by the alliance with the Kuomintang in China and the quote Anglo-Russian Committee, with its apparent collaboration with the British trade union leadership, were followed by a drastic left turn in strategy and tactics. All this had led some of Trotsky's former supporters, notably Radek, Preobrazhensky, and Smilga, to reapply for membership of the party from which they had been expelled, and in various degrees to renounce their oppositionist views. I always forget who Smilga is. Ivar Smilga lived from 1892 to 1938 and was a Latvian Bolshevik leader, Soviet politician, and economist. He was a member of the left opposition in the Soviet Union. Back to the text. All this led some of Trotsky's former supporters, notably Karl Radek, Evgeny Preobrazhensky, Ivar Smilga, to reapply for membership of the party from which Karl Radek, Evgeny Preobrazhensky, and Ivar Smilga had been expelled, and in various degrees to renounce their oppositionist views. This did not prevent Radek, Preobrazhensky, and Smilga, or the far more craven Zinoviev and Kamenev, from sharing the fate of the stauncher oppositionists when killing time came. During the period covered by these notes, collectivization and the deportation of the kulaks occurred, as did an even greater speed up in the tempos of industrialization. Abroad there was the rise of the Nazis in Germany, the beginnings of the Great Depression, political crisis in Spain, while Trotsky tried to find himself a home and also political allies among left communists, Stalinist repression meanwhile intensified. The first subject to be discussed was the reason for Trotsky's exile. There was a quotation from Stalin's speech at the Politburo, allegedly from the stenographic report. The object was to discredit Trotsky and the opposition, as he would inevitably appear to have gone over to the bourgeoisie. End quote. If Trotsky attacks and exposes the leadership, then we can present Trotsky as a traitor. End quote. Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky, not yet expelled, were shown as voting against deportation. Alas, this never seemed to have lessened Trotsky's animus against these so-called, quote, rights. Trotsky saw what was taking place as what he called, quote, Bonapartist usurpation, end quote. And that Stalin was already trying to, quote, link the opposition with plots and the preparation of an armed uprising, end quote. The better to repress it, to, quote, draw a line of blood between the official party and the opposition, end quote. In his Letter to the Workers of the USSR, Trotsky indignantly denied reports that he left Russia of his own volition. No, Trotsky asked instead to be imprisoned. To leave Russia voluntarily would represent an admission that the situation was hopeless. Trotsky vigorously attacks the, quote, capitulationists, i.e. Radek and Preobrazhensky. What then was his own understanding of Stalin's, quote, left turn? First, there was stress on the role of the left opposition in forcing or pushing the Stalinist majority leftwards. They are repeatedly labeled, quote, centrists, between left and right, maneuvering under stress of circumstances, quote, finding themselves in an economic cul-de-sac. The Stalinist cadres, against their will, are undertaking a leftward zigzag, which in the process of struggle took them further left than they wished. 9/10 of these cadres dream of returning as soon as possible to a more, quote, sound, quote, normal, quote, national line, and hate us precisely because by our implacable stand, we prevent them from doing this, end quote. Trotsky. Quote, for a serious Marxist, it is clear that the centrist, end quote, left turn was ensured exclusively by our struggle. Excuse me, I fucked that last sentence up. Quote, for a serious Marxist, it is clear that the centrist left turn was ensured exclusively by our struggle, end quote. Trotsky. The, quote, centrists were seen as allies until 1928 of the right, of Bukharin and co. Bukharin and Bukharin's friends represented the kulak interest, the, quote, centrist, that of the bureaucracy, much of it non-proletarian origin or non-Bolshevik. And this tended of its nature to unite with the right, quote, Thermidor, and, quote, Thermidor's Russian implications, parenthesis, and applicability of the parallel, end parenthesis, was much discussed. In a long piece written in September 1929, Trotsky refers repeatedly to the dangers of Thermidor, but rejects the view that it had already occurred, since, if so, the USSR must have a bourgeois government, which is a proposition he finds unacceptable, since he believed the system could be reformed. In retrospect, much of the analysis was not only wide of the mark, but too schematic, too wedded to dogmatic Marxian categories of class, into which individual policy positions were too neatly fitted. We shall see how this led to further misunderstanding. Another and more, quote, objectively based explanation of the left turn in domestic politics was the economic problem. Especially it was seen by Trotsky as a kulak strike, the withholding of grain in the winter of 1927-28. This forced Stalin to recognize the danger of the kulaks, for so long denied by Trotsky. This forced Stalin to recognize the danger of the kulaks, for so long denied by Stalin and Stalin's faction, and the emergency action which this strike rendered necessary led to a breach with Bukharin and the, quote, right. Trotsky and his friends had also urged higher industrialization tempos, and they had been criticized for this. But now in 1928, the urgency of more investments, especially in heavy industry, became apparent. On this view, Stalin, quote, cling to unlimited apparatus absolutism, end quote, after having politically destroyed the left opposition, found himself under the necessity of adopting their policies. However, this was done in an adventuristic, bureaucratic way, so that in fact he went much further, both in industrial and peasant policies, than the opposition wished or the real situation warranted. A key element in the criticism, understandably, was the regime and the party, the persecution of the opposition, the suppression of free discussion at all levels. But at this early stage, the chief fear seems to have been that Stalin and Stalin's bureaucrats, owing to the position they occupied in the opposition's, quote, class analysis, and their irresponsibility to the workers, would swing back to the right. Among Trotsky's ablest and most eloquent supporters was Rakovsky. Writing in April 1929, he noted that the leadership had been, quote, compelled to appropriate for its own use many elements from the opposition's platform, was compelled to repeat after us that every concession to the kulaks or other hostile classes would lead to their strengthening, ... end quote, and so on. But, quote, all this is but words, still faithful to its centrist position, which consists of uttering left phrases and committing right deeds, ... asserting in words the existence of a right danger, announcing that any concessions to the kulak must be eliminated. The party leaders in practice made concession after concession. Thus, in June 1928, the party leadership raised grain prices. End quote. I think that's Christian Rakovsky, that was the quote from. Similar views were expressed by others, for instance, Sosnovsky. Even when kulaks were being deported, the expectation was that the strata of kulaks would rise again within the collective farms, this being based on the fact that these farms were being created before the necessary machinery could be supplied. Therefore, the peasants would work in the main with their own equipment. Therefore, differentiation among the peasantry would revive, giving rise to kulaks yet again. As we shall see, Trotsky and Trotsky's friends had some very acute things to say about agriculture, but this certainly was not one of them. What of the international left turn? Here Trotsky points to the transference of the international of the typical Stalinist tactics. Quote, centrism is a midpoint between reformism and communism. Centrism does not and cannot have centrism's own line, ... Centrism zigzags from one extreme to the other, ... Centrism is wholly bureaucratized and wholly subordinate to the commands of the top of the Stalinist fraction. This gives to each zigzag of the leadership an international aspect, regardless of the real situation of the labor movement in the given country. As a result, world communism loses ground, end quote. Trotsky. Here, of course, the opposition is on solid ground, and there appear many bitter and well-documented denunciations of the extremist tactics of the period, quote, social fascism, among those tactics. As in the case of industrial and peasant policy inside the USSR, the leadership is blamed for first refusing to listen to, quote, left criticism, e.g., the disastrous Chinese policy of 1926 to 27, and then for a rush to ultra-left excesses, which was combined with the elimination of any leaders who might question Stalin's infallibility. Let us now proceed to analyze the views expressed in the bulletin by subject, as the situation developed, beginning with the internal affairs and with agriculture, i.e. essentially the issue of forcible collectivization. Trotsky analyzed the problem clearly enough. Agriculture was backward and fragmented. In conditions of isolation, i.e. without support from more developed socialist countries, there was bound to be difficulty. Peasants gained in land and the abolition of rent. They lost through prices. High-cost state industry had to raise additional resources for investment through prices. Trotsky himself coined the term, quote, price scissors in 1923. Trotsky repeated that the peasantry had to pay, quote, tribute, but seemed also to agree that the, quote, scissors of 1923 had opened too wide, i.e. the peasants were too greatly overcharged. Trotsky also continued to argue both, that the condition of the working class ought to be more rapidly improved, and that much greater efforts to industrialize should have begun much earlier, say in 1924. This combination of arguments suggests certain inconsistencies. Of course, it is easy to say that if industry grew faster, exchanges at the villages could take place on an expanded basis, which would have encouraged more marketed production, more of which could have been exported to buy more foreign machines and other goods. It was indeed part of the, quote, left case that the leaders were going too slowly. Trotsky quotes mockingly and repeatedly Bukharin's phrase about going at, quote, the pace of a tortoise, end quote. But why did Bukharin use these words? Surely not because this was a pace Bukharin preferred, but because within the constraints of the new economic policy, there was little room for maneuver. At no point does Trotsky quantify what additional measures, which would not antagonize the peasantry and cause the blades of the scissors crisis to widen, could in fact have been taken in 1924 to 26, say. More could have been done, no doubt, but how much more? And what difference would it have made? Matters are not helped by repeated accusations, directed at Bukharin and Stalin, of having been too soft on the kulak for too long. Surely, sterner measures against the more prosperous peasants would have had adverse effects on production and marketing? ? More collectives? ? But Trotsky himself argued that this depended on new techniques, not yet available, and on the willingness of the peasants to join, as he did not advocate coercion, except to restrain the exploitive tendencies of kulaks, . Trotsky rightly points out that the speed up of industrialization in 1928 to 29 inevitably led to shortages, cues, these being, quote, the most vivid argument against socialism in a separate country, end quote, Trotsky. Trotsky showed no sign of understanding the connection between shortages and prices, however, or at least not yet. As already mentioned, Trotsky viewed the grain procurement crisis of the winter 1927-28 as a manifestation of kulak power, and regarded the belated and too small price rise of mid-1928 as an intolerable concession to market forces. It follows that Trotsky favored the, quote, extraordinary measures taken by Stalin, though perhaps not the crudity with which he collected the grain. Indeed, Trotsky in some of his correspondence alleged that, in the course of these exactions, the kulak was still somewhat favored. This, I suppose, followed from his mistaken picture of the nature of Stalinist, quote, centrism. The bureaucracy just had to be kulak influenced, and no doubt some of the bureaucrats were, ! End parenthesis. Eventually, Trotsky recognized that the anti-kulak campaign was real. But of course, quote, the kulak is not separated from the middle peasants by the impenetrable wall. Under conditions of commodity production, the middle peasants automatically produce kulaks from among themselves. The hail of administrative blows on the kulaks, uncoordinated and panicky, which hit not only kulaks but put a barrier to the development of the upper strata of the middle peasantry. ... The peasants started to rush around looking for another way forward. Thus, quote, total collectivization, end quote, arose, end quote. Trotsky, written in February 1930. Here and elsewhere, Trotsky showed that at first thought... Here and elsewhere, Trotsky showed that at first, Trotsky thought that the leadership had been taken unawares by the peasants' rush to join the collectives. A rush due to the state's actions in closing markets and enforcing compulsory deliveries. Quote, the gates of the market were locked. After awaiting in fear outside those gates, the peasantry rushed into the only gates that were open, the collectivization gates, end quote. Trotsky. But then, quote, the collective farm can now become a new form of disguise for the kulak, end quote. Trotsky, parenthesis, How wrong this was! Exclamation point in parentheses. By June 1930, two things had become apparent in messages received from Russia. The first was the extent of administrative coercion against both the kulaks and ordinary peasants, coercion which had the result of causing even the poorest peasants to take a negative view of collectivization. The other was Stalin's notorious, quote, "dizzy with success" article, which laid the blame for excesses on local officials, and which led to a rush of peasants to get out of the collectives, parenthesis, into which they are compelled to return in subsequent years, end parenthesis. An article by F. Dingelstedt refers to, quote, "wholesale collectivization carried out by crudely violent methods has caused unparalleled disruption in the national economy," end quote. Huge losses in livestock, utter confusion in the minds of officialdom, precipitate retreat, all are noted, and justly so. Quote, "We are for industrialization and collectivization," end quote, but, quote, "against bureaucratic charlatanism," end quote. But in November 1930, the error is repeated. Quote, "collective farms without the necessary industrial base will inevitably secrete kulaks." To call wholesale collectivization based on peasant tools socialist amounts to reviving the Bukharinist theory of the growing into socialism of the kulaks, but in administratively disguised and so more malignant form, end quote. Apart from this tendency to expect the Stalinist, quote, centrism to swing right, Trotsky's other error in respect of agriculture appears to me to have been derived from a gross overestimation of the advantages of large-scale mechanized cultivation. In this, Trotsky followed Lenin, parenthesis, quote, "if we had 100,000 tractors, then the peasants would say, quote, 'we are for communism,' end quote, end parenthesis." I guess that quotes Lenin. Trotsky was thus able to argue both that collectivization was necessary and that collectivization could be carried out voluntarily as the necessary machinery became available. Subsequent experience, parenthesis, in Poland, to go no further, end parenthesis, suggests that this view is wrong. Stalin, brutal though Stalin was, seemed to have been more realistic about peasant attitudes. This brings one to Trotsky's views on tempos of industrialization and accumulation. As already mentioned, Trotsky repeatedly asserted that the troubles of 1928 to 1930 would have been avoided. The need for drastic action would have been far smaller, if only the policies he advocated in 1923 to 25 had been followed. True enough, he was able to show that Stalin had denounced his proposals as adventurous and super-industrializing before adopting wildly extravagant and unreal tempos and successively more ambitious versions of the first 5-year plan. True also that the official forecasts of industrial growth for the period of 1924 to 1928 were exceeded in practice, and this could be presented as proof that they were too low. But Trotsky nowhere compares these actual growth rates with those he advocated. In these 5 years, industrial output more than trebled. True, Trotsky urged more for heavy industry, including in the tractor industry. But at the cost of what? Workers, consumer goods industries, peasants? One could hardly get far by just increasing taxes on kulaks. What was the room for maneuver available within the NEP? In Trotsky's article in Vestnik Kommunistической Akademii, 1927, number 22, Trotsky's former comrade Evgeny Preobrazhensky vividly described the dilemmas and the constraints which, in Preobrazhensky's judgment, followed inexorably from Russia's backwardness and isolation. Trotsky himself on occasion used similar arguments when denouncing the Stalinist concept of socialism in one country and stressing the need for revolution in advanced capitalist countries. But, given that these revolutions had not occurred, this reader at least is left with the impression that Trotsky, like so many other oppositionists the world over, had not worked out the, quote, feasibilities of Trotsky's alternative policy. But, this said, his and his comrades' denunciations of Stalinist excesses were quick, sharp, and very much to the point. True enough, as Trotsky said in 1928-29, there was a violent change in official policy. Quote, all arguments against, quote, superindustrialization, end quote, were suddenly rejected. The apparatus, working for years in the spirit of economic Menshevism, received orders to regard as heretical all that had previously been holy writ, and to turn into official figures those heresies which yesterday had been called, quote, Trotskyist. The apparatus, communists and specialists alike, were quite unprepared for this task. Attempts to resist or timidly to seek explanations led to immediate and severe punishment. Planning officials accepted that it was better to stand for high tempos than to sit in prison for lower ones, end quote. Trotsky. November-December 1929. Trotsky followed with a vigorous article entitled On Economic Adventurism and Its Dangers, referring again to the swinging from overcaution to extremism. Quote, now the slogan is full speed ahead regardless of anything. The plan is repeatedly revised upwards. From passive possibilism, bracket sick and bracket, the opportunists have gone over to unbridled subjectivism. If a manager or worker refers to objective obstacles, such as poor quality equipment, lack of raw materials, this is treated as treason to the revolution, end quote. Trotsky. In the article, what was the article called? On Economic Adventurism and Its Dangers, from 1930. From time to time, Trotsky used the evidence of high tempos actually achieved, or claimed, as evidence both of the correctness of the earlier criticism by the left opposition and as proof of the advantages of a, quote, centralized state economy, end quote. For instance, see number 10, page 16, end parenthesis. However, Trotsky returns again and again, and quite rightly, to criticizing unsound extremism, quote, prize gallop industrialization, end quote, which Trotsky contrasted with Trotsky's own policy, which is not, quote, the general line of the bureaucrats, end quote, but which, quote, flowed from an assessment of the real and dynamic equilibrium of economic and class factors, including international ones, end quote. And again, on the same page, Trotsky notes the tendency to ignore material constraints on industrialization tempos, which lead to, quote, breaches of all economic and therefore also social equilibria, end quote. Parenthesis, letter dated 20th of December 1929, in parenthesis. Note the use twice on one page of the word, quote, equilibrium, end quote. There are some who imagine that this was a word used only by Bukharin and the, quote, rightists. Footnote. See also the article of Richard Day, published in New Left Review, which recounts Trotsky's dispute with Kondratiev about, quote, long-wave cycles, end quote, and in which the concept, quote, equilibrium, plays a major role. See Day's book, Leon Trotsky and the Politics of Economic Isolation, published in 1973, for evidence of Trotsky's view of the market as against bureaucratic centralization in subsequent years. End footnote. Trotsky, unlike some naive contemporary, quote, Trotskyists, did not ignore the existence of interest groups during the period of socialist construction, and indeed advocated them. Conflict, quote, would increase greatly on a new basis. There would be fractions of, quote, electrifiers, quote, oilmen, quote, peatmen, quote, tractorists, quote, collectivizers, etc., and the struggle of these in a framework of industrial democracy were one of the important ways of regulating industrial development, end quote. Trotsky. The elimination of these open conflicts was, in his view, a very important reason for unbalanced extremism. Perhaps Bukharin was right in warning the party against unbalanced extremism in his well-known article, something in Russian, Zametki Ekonomista, from 1928. Apparently not. At the time and subsequently, Trotsky regarded as evidence of right-wing deviation. Trotsky remained obstinately unable to see any virtues in the, quote, right position. Quote, we have nothing in common with them, end quote, particularly as they then capitulated to Stalin. Quote, the rightists are as, quote, correct on questions of industrialization as the French Social Democrats are right in saying, contrary to Molotov, that there is no revolutionary situation in France, end quote. In other words, while facts are facts, those who point them out can, parenthesis, in this case, should, end parenthesis, be regarded as enemies, though of course for other reasons. Trotsky too denounced adventurism, failed to take account of social economic constraints and lack of resources, which led to heavy losses in agriculture and to acute disproportions in industry, fall in quality, inflation, reduction in living standards in town and country, etc. Writing from his place of exile in July-August 1930, Rakovsky followed his very solidly argued and highly critical analysis with the conclusion that a retreat from extremism was essential, but he too attacked the, quote, rightists, who also are supposed to be counseling retreat. Quote, the difference between us and the rightists is the difference between an army in orderly retreat and fleeing deserters. The apparent similarity on the surface arises from the fact that the army and the deserters are proceeding for a time in the same direction. Quote. Trotsky several times attacked Stalin's policy as being excessively autarkic. That's to say, not enough attention was paid to the possibilities opened up by world trade. Russia's economic weakness could be somewhat mitigated by utilizing the international division of labor as the Great Depression developed. He also saw clear political as well as economic advantages in barter agreements with Western countries. The USSR could gain materially and also demonstrate to the numerous unemployed the superiority of a planned economy. However, on the evidence of these issues of his journal, it is hardly possible to assert that Trotsky believed that socialism could be built in Russia, integrated more closely into the world trade system, as seems to be argued by Day in his already cited book. Mocking negative comments on, quote, socialism in one country continue throughout these 2 years. Trotsky and his friends complained with wholly understandable and growing bitterness about the repression from which Trotsky's fraction suffered in the Soviet Union. These were still the first years in which the GPU, forerunner of the NKVD and of today's KGB, turned its coercive power upon communist oppositionists. Trotsky learned with evident horror of the shooting of Blyumkin, the ex-left SR assassin of Count Mirbach in 1918, who had become a communist GPU official, in parentheses, apparently for making unauthorized contact with Trotsky in Constantinople. Shooting of oppositionists was not practiced at this period, so this case was unique. Others were in exile in prison, communicating with increasing difficulty with each other and with the outside world, and often in bad health and climatically harsh places. False accusations were made about their alleged counter-revolutionary acts and beliefs, calling forth a long series of spirited denials from them and from Trotsky, to whom, at least until 1932, they were still able occasionally to smuggle letters. It seems as if the bulletin itself found its way into Russia, probably by the same route, via the journeys of Soviet officials to and from Europe. Possibly this helps to explain why Stalin was to massacre so high a proportion of Soviet diplomats a few years later. Trotsky, Rakovsky, and their comrades could therefore have had few illusions about their enemy, Stalin, and Stalin's system of, quote, justice. All the more astonishing is their credulity with regard to false accusations made about others than themselves by this very same GPU. Thus, in an article unsigned about the, quote, trial of the wreckers of the so-called, quote, industrial party, Prompartia, in 1930, Trotsky's journal accepted all the accusations and confessions as true and used the evidence about the anti-industrialization activities of Ramzan and other, quote, wreckers to attack the Stalin-Bukharin line. Quote, in 1923-28, i.e. during the assault against the left opposition, the Central Committee was unconsciously acting with wrecker specialists who, in their turn, were paid agents of foreign imperialists, ... end quote. Of course, these specialists had occupied leading positions in the planning and managerial mechanism in those years. All this was proved, quote, by undeniable juridical proofs, end quote. Well. No wonder these very same specialists hated and feared the left opposition, as may be seen from evidence in the valuable book by N. Valentinov. More striking still was the reaction of Trotsky, or perhaps of his son Sadov, who acted as editor, the article is unsigned, to the so-called trial of the Mensheviks in 1931. Again, the accusations are believed, although they were even more far-fetched than those directed at the non-existent Prompartia, and were vigorously denied by the, quote, implicated émigré Mensheviks. They were alleged to have made clandestine journeys to Russia at dates at which they were attending conferences in the West, and were supposed to have plotted to invade the Soviet Union with the aid of the imperialists and of such notoriously warlike figures as MacDonald and Blum. Yet these stories were eagerly swallowed by the Trotskyists of the period. The ex-Mensheviks, men like Groman, Bazarov, Ginsburg, etc., worked willingly in Stalin's economic apparatus so long as the Stalin line was against the left opposition. But when Stalin turned left, the Mensheviks, turned to plotting. Quote, the links of the Mensheviks with the wreckers on the one hand, with the imperialist bourgeoisie on the other, represent nothing unexpected, end quote. The, quote, incontrovertible evidence, end quote, showed that it was impossible to advocate, quote, pure democracy without advocating, quote, capitalism, and in turn, quote, one can not move towards capitalism without becoming agents of the international bourgeoisie. In its class content, the role of the Mensheviks in the USSR differs not at all from the role of the Labour Party in Britain, the Social Democrats in Germany. The form is different, ... but the essence is the same. The struggle against the Social Democrats is the struggle with the democratic wing of imperialism, end quote. Left Opposition Bulletin, or the Bulletin Opposition, I don't know how to say it in Russian. Yet here again the evidence, the confessions, the trial did not merely contain lies, but what the Russians called vranyo, totally invented fantastical rubbish, all of it written to order in the procurator's office. So blinded was Trotsky by his, quote, class analysis of the role that Social Democrats ought to be playing, and that it did not occur to him to question the, quote, evidence. Yet when a communist ideologist of repute, David Ryazanov, who was the head of the original MEGA, Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe in Russia, was expelled from the party and accused of plotting with the Mensheviks, Trotsky exploded with indignation about these Stalinist slanders. In this instance, Trotsky could see that the GPU chiefs, Menjinsky and Yagoda, would accuse Ryazanov of, quote, anything if so ordered, end quote. So how does it happen that the same Trotsky is so credulous if those accused happen to be politically alien to him? Perhaps part of this blindness may be connected with his refusal to discern the real nature of Stalinism for too long. Or rather, Trotsky saw only part of the truth. The word, quote, centrism was used, along with, quote, thermidor, and on occasion Bonapartism. Trotsky could see that the old party was being destroyed with something despotic, that something despotic was taking its place, and he denounced these tendencies eloquently. Yet it was still somehow his party. He sent appeals to it. The quote Stalinist bureaucracy was to Trotsky an alien growth. Trotsky looked for links with the old ruling classes, with kulaks, with bourgeois specialists. That the party could actually degenerate from within its own working class core, Trotsky found hard to admit. In extenuation, it might be said that, though the party members were indeed cowed into obedience, they were not yet the disciplined servants whom Stalin wanted. Stalin had to kill many of them a few years afterwards. Nonetheless, Trotsky cannot be said to have understood at this stage just what forces were betraying or digging the grave of the revolution Trotsky believed in. It was not Trotsky but Rakovsky who had the honesty to raise the key issues. Rakovsky, on the evidence of these volumes, was a man of courage and intelligence who is worthy of much more thorough study. Rakovsky's letter on the causes of the degeneration of the party and the state apparatus, written in exile in Astrakhan on the 2nd of August 1928, published in the Opposition Bulletin No. 6, deserves translation in full. Footnote, it has in fact been translated and may be found in Irving Howe's book, Essential Works of Socialism. And footnote. I should read that book. Where am I? Rakovsky noted the passive indifference of the working class, including party members, in the face of growing arbitrariness and appalling abuses of power. This has been disputed. Just as a side note for myself, this has been disputed. There was actually a pretty substantial resistance on the part of the working class, even though it was like scattered and depoliticized to a large extent. There was pretty strong worker unrest in the early days of the end of the new economic policy and the beginning of the first 5-year plan. That the left opposition did not try to get involve itself with. Anyway, Rakovsky noted the passive indifference of the working class, including party members, in the face of growing arbitrariness and abuses of power. Rakovsky then tackles the problem of the changes that take place when the working class becomes a ruling class. This situation is full of danger. This would exist even if there were no non-proletarian classes and no hostile capitalist environment. This would exist even if there were no proletarian classes and no hostile capitalist environment. It is the, quote, professional risk, end quote, of power. The, quote, professional risk of power. One must, Rakovsky wrote, look at the relations which the seizure of power creates within the working class. Quote, when this class seizes power, a certain part of this class turns into agents of authority. In this way, bureaucracy arises. In a proletarian state in which capitalist accumulation is forbidden for the ruling party, the above-mentioned differentiation is at first functional, but later becomes social, end quote. Rakovsky lists various material privileges distinguishing the ex-worker official from ordinary workers. Quote, the unity, which was formerly the consequence of revolutionary class struggle, can now be preserved only through a whole system of influences designed to preserve equilibrium between various groups of the same class and of the same party, to subordinate them to the basic goal, end quote. Individual rights are meaningless unless there is the necessary, quote, political ability, end quote, to use them. He went on to cite Robespierre's warnings against becoming, quote, drunk with power, end quote. In the USSR, quote, the party and the working class neither physically nor morally resembles what they were 10 years earlier, A party member of 1917 would scarcely recognize himself in a party member of 1928, end quote. Rakovsky. Christian Rakovsky urged careful study of these changes, quote, in substance and in function, including the composition of the working class itself and the working class's experience, end quote. Rakovsky draws attention both to the miserable lower strata, parenthesis, quote, living on the borderlands on the tiny government doles, beggary, robbery, and prostitution, end quote, end parenthesis, and to the effect on the psychology of former workers of their rise to leading governmental and managerial positions. Quote, for instance, an administrator Dergemorda, bracket, police sergeant type, end bracket, though a communist, though a proletarian origin, though maybe only a few years ago actually working at a lathe, will not now embody, in his relation with the workers, the best qualities of the proletariat, end quote. Christian Rakovsky. And of course, the party also contains non-proletarian elements, parenthesis, though Rakovsky had the ruthless honesty not to lay stress on this, nor, as we have seen, on the capitalist environment and the petty bourgeois peasantry as basic explanatory factors of the phenomena Rakovsky was analyzing, end parenthesis. One second. All right. Sorry about that. Quote, Soviet and party bureaucracy, bracket, Rakovsky went on, end bracket, is a phenomenon of a new order, a new sociological category to which a whole dissertation should be devoted, end quote. But why, he asks, are the workers in and out of the party so passive? Some comrades regarded, quote, green procurement and self-criticism, end quote, as due to the resistance of the proletarian elements of the party, parenthesis, to the alleged right-wing course of Stalin and Bukharin, end parenthesis. But this was false, the policy change in these respects being decided at the top. Pressure from the workers was quite insufficient to prevent the expulsion of the opposition. The vast majority of workers who joined the party in the 1920s had no idea what the party had once been like. They lacked a sense of class solidarity. They needed a, quote, long and difficult, end quote, period of being taught. Lenin saw the need to protect the party and the working class from the, quote, decomposing effects of privilege, preferment, and petty advantage, end quote, which was associated with power in the past, avoiding the influence of the new economic policy and of bourgeois habits of mind. The party leadership was to have created a genuinely worker-peasant administrative apparatus, and it failed. A powerful analysis, but the analysis' conclusion raises a question. If the worker members of the party, who were often semi-literate, were raised to positions of authority and were prone to abuse their position, becoming separated by their essential functions from the masses whence they came, who is to carry out the, quote, long and difficult, end quote, learning process of the workers and peasants in the apparatus? Honest intellectuals like Rakovsky? But was it not inevitable that they would be thrust aside? Was this not a predictable tragedy? Rakovsky was co-author with V. Kossior and Muralov and V. Kasparova of a declaration which was sent to the 16th Party Congress in April 1930 and was published in numbers 17 to 18. After a vigorous criticism of agricultural and industrial policies and of falling living standards, the authors returned to the theme of the style of the party rule and of bureaucracy. Quote, from a workers' state with bureaucratic deformations, Lenin's definition of our form of government, we are developing into a bureaucratic state with proletarian communist relics. A bureaucratic state with proletarian communist relics. Before our very eyes, there has been and is being formed a large class of rulers. With that large class of rulers, own inner subdivisions going through calculated co-option, parenthesis, through bureaucratic appointment or fictional elections, in parenthesis. What unites this peculiar, parenthesis, Zvoorajny, in parenthesis, sort of class with a peculiar sort of private property, namely state power. Quote, the bureaucracy possesses the state as private property, end quote, said Marx in the, quote, critique of Hegel's state law, end quote. End quote. Rakovsky. They go on, quote, it is not hard to guess how attractive for the bureaucracy are wholesale collectivization and extremely rapid industrialization tempos. They enlarge the army of bureaucrats. The bureaucracy share in the national income. The bureaucracy's power over the masses, end quote. Rakovsky and his friends, V. Kosior, N. Muralov, and V. Kasparova, where the hell am I? Also attacked the leadership's national policy, the weakening of the power of the republics, the growth of bureaucratic centralism, a theme which had brought Rakovsky into conflict with Stalin in earlier years also. It's interesting how the words, quote, class of rulers are used rather than, quote, ruling class. This must have been the subject of heated debate among the opposition, parenthesis, it still is, exclamation point, end parenthesis. Rakovsky's analysis led to a lively discussion among exiled oppositionists, and several discussion documents from Russia were printed in numbers 15 to 16. Quote, what is the bureaucracy, a class or not a class, end quote. A group or person named XYZ wrote, quote, up to the moment when the bureaucracy can be seen as a group or a caste, the bureaucracy's domination, however despotic, did not deprive the state of the state's proletarian character. But once the bureaucracy became a class, which you, bracket Rakovsky, and bracket assert it has become, the Soviet state has at once shed its proletarian clothing, ... One must choose. Either the ruling bureaucracy is a class, in which case the dictatorship of the proletariat is no more, or else the bureaucracy is a group or a caste, ... end quote. The critics note that bureaucracies have grown up everywhere, control the state in many countries, but, quote, Marx never defined the bureaucracy as a class, end quote. So, quote, in our view, the bureaucracy is not a class and will never become a class. It will degenerate. The bureaucracy is a nucleus of a class which would not be a bureaucracy, but another hitherto unknown one. Its appearance will mean that the working class will become another oppressed class. The bureaucracy is the nucleus of some kind of capitalist class, controlling the state and collectively owning the means of production, end quote. How, quote, modern all this sounds. Marxists are still puzzling over these perplexing questions. How significant in this entire analysis is Russian backwardness? It seems to me to underlie much of Rakovsky's analysis. Though Rakovsky refers to it only by implication, Trotsky himself was, at least at this period, less forthright in analyzing the proletarian origins of the Stalinist, quote, bureaucracy, but showed very clear awareness of the importance of the, quote, historical peculiarities of Russia, end quote. To cite the title of his own article published in 1921, this contrasts with the schematic ahistoricism of many who now call themselves Trotskyists. Attacking Stalin's crude assertion that all communists should base their policies on, quote, the general features of capitalism, end quote, which are basically, quote, identical in all countries, end quote, Trotsky argued thus, quote, national peculiarity is the most general, so to speak, summary product of the unevenness of historical development. This must be correctly understood as a whole, including the pre-capitalist past, the more rapid or slower development of productive forces, the gradual or rapid way in which the whole historical epochs are passed through, e.g. medievalism, craft guilds, enlightened absolutism, parliamentarism, the unevenness of economic development, of various classes and social institutions, and of culture, ... All these things lie at the basis of national, quote, peculiarities. The October Revolution was the most grandiose of the manifestations of uneven historical development. The theory of permanent revolution, which gave the prognosis of the October Revolution, was based on the law of unevenness, ... and not its not in its abstract but in its material manifestation in the form of the social and political peculiarities of Russia. End quote. Trotsky. Trotsky then contrasts his analysis with Stalin's, quote, messianic nationalism accompanied by bureaucratic abstract internationalism, end quote. Socialism in one country, which positively exaggerates the peculiarities of Russia, parenthesis, quote, permitting the building of socialism regardless of what happens with the rest of humanity, end quote, end parenthesis, plus the disregard of the specific features of all other countries and parties. Trotsky again refers with emphasis to Russia's backwardness in another article, but then in assessing the role of the party in this situation, he loses his way. Quote, if we admit for a moment that economic officials and the ruling stratum of workers cease altogether to be under party discipline, then the road to socialism will be barred, end quote. He imagined the trust becoming more autonomous, weakening planning and giving rise to a struggle between management and workers. He went on, quote, does the present party regime, despite economic successes, threaten the collapse of party lines and discipline? Certainly, end quote. Immediately afterwards, he wrote that, quote, the party as a party does not exist today, end quote. And again, there seems something wrong with his analysis. It was not the weakening of the party discipline which was barring the road to socialism. Indeed, later in the same article, he was speculating on possible, quote, counter-revolutionary regimes, with elements of Thermidor and Bonapartism, i.e. a greater or lesser role would be played by the Bolshevik Soviet bureaucracy, civil and military, and at the same time this regime will be the dictatorship of the sword over society in the interest of the bourgeoisie against the people, end quote. Yes, but a year earlier he wrote to Souverine, quote, the problem of Thermidor and Bonapartism is in its essence the problem of the kulaks, end quote. Quote, the problem of Thermidor and Bonapartism is in its essence the problem of the kulak, end quote. Trotsky. It seems to me that Rakovsky understood it all better. Finally, a too brief look at foreign affairs. There is no need here to repeat Trotsky's frequent and well-known criticisms of the disastrous China policy of 1927. Trotsky drew the conclusion that there should only be a, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, not, quote, the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, end quote. Where, one wonders, would Mao Zedong's strategy fit in, which was already then in the process of development? Trotsky devoted much space to supporting the Soviet stand on the Chinese Eastern Railway against Chiang Kai-shek. For Trotsky, it was an essential test. Those oppositionists abroad who saw no point in defending Stalin's Russia against what was, after all, an attempt by China to eliminate extraterritorial rights received short shrift. Trotsky devoted several effective articles, notably in number 8, to the errors and follies of the Comintern. The, quote, left turn of 1928 to 29 was based on no solid evidence. The party was everywhere in decline. The unreal assessment of the situation, the extremist tactics advocated, parenthesis, quote, general strike, quote, class against class, quote, Soviet power, and so on, in parenthesis, the lack of attention to local conditions, the total subordination of the foreign parties to the Comintern, and so to Moscow, and the expulsion of any leaders who had independent ideas, all these tendencies were very properly denounced. All this was largely written by Trotsky himself. Understandably, oppositionists in Russia wrote primarily about the internal situation. This note is already too long, and it has deliberately concentrated on Soviet internal affairs. I will therefore be brief in referring to two other, quote, international, end quote, matters. Trotsky's relation with other oppositions and, quote, social fascism. Trotsky tried, of course, to maintain links with other leftists in various countries. There are letters to the Italian opposition, following the expulsion in 1929 of many of the old leaders, and the firm establishment of the leadership of Ercole Tagliati. There are correspondence with and articles about members of the Leninbund and other German opposition groups, those around the periodical Vérité in France, written with some survivors in even with some survivors in Shanghai. Trotsky criticized the small Belgian, quote, left group, led by Van Overstraten, for not supporting the USSR over the Chinese railway. Trotsky wrote to the Austrian opposition and to Hungarian émigrés, urging them to work together against Stalinism and Belacunism. There is even a proclamation, quote, to the communists of China and all the world, end quote. Yet how weak and insignificant were all these forces? There he was, writing at length about the dictatorship of the proletariat as the only alternative to Italian fascism, or on what to do in Spain, or the ideological errors of Brandler and Thalheimer in Germany, or the slogan of the Constituent Assembly in China. Of course, Trotsky also wrote about uniting the various opposition fractions or fragments. But, as Deutscher and others have noted long ago, how few were Trotsky's followers, how politically ineffective, even meaningless, were Trotsky's eloquent, if sometimes dogmatic, words. On the issue of, quote, social fascism, the dogmatic ultra-left turn of the Comintern gave Trotsky an opportunity for eloquent attacks on a basically absurd official line. It must be stressed that Trotsky was bitterly hostile to the social democratic leadership. Many of Trotsky's words can be cited to show that, quote, that he denounced them unmercifully as bourgeois and counter-revolutionary by nature, end quote. Thus, quote, Mueller and MacDonald groveled disgustingly, end quote, trying to prop up capitalism, etc., etc. Trotsky's attacks on the Anglo-Russian Committee also showed how Trotsky regarded moderate labor and trade union elements. However, Trotsky was quick to see how absurd was the slogan of, quote, social fascism, and quick also to stress the danger of fascism in Germany. This danger in Trotsky's eyes was enhanced by the, quote, conservative role of social democracy, end quote, as well as by the weakness and errors of the communists. Trotsky created social democracy as a, quote, powerful enemy. Trotsky treated social democracy as a, quote, powerful enemy, but as a powerful enemy which, quote, cannot be fought by incantations, end quote. Most workers and trade unionists still follow the social democrats in Germany, France, Britain, Austria, etc. One must plainly avoid offending and repulsing those workers and those trade unionists. And the abuse of, quote, social fascist nonsense, which the Stalinist leadership of the Comintern was perpetrating, was, Trotsky rightly insisted, stupid and harmful. The chosen tactic helped the social democratic leadership. Quote, in those countries where fascism is a powerful force, it is easy for the social democrats to show not only the difference, but also the hostility between them and fascism, A barrier is erected between the communist and the social democratic workers, end quote, Trotsky. And these arguments are repeated and developed in other articles. In retrospect, it is astonishing to read the official communist literature of the time. Trotsky's intransigent attitude to anyone to the, quote, right of Trotsky was notorious, but Trotsky saw clearly the ultra-stupidities of the Comintern and Stalin line. That line was indeed suicidal. I hope that this survey, though incomplete, may help the reader to appreciate the Soviet, quote, left opposition. I hope that this survey, though incomplete, may help the reader to appreciate how the Soviet, quote, left opposition saw the world and above all their own country at a critical time. It's the end of the piece. Thanks for listening.